I now declare open the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference, and welcome all members of the committee here this morning and also our witnesses and the Secretariat today. In accordance with the committee's resolutions, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I do remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now welcome Ms. Erin Molan to give evidence today and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
My name is Erin Molan, and I guess the capacity in which I could appear would be that of a campaigner, I guess a victim of social media abuse and threats, and someone who just cares deeply about this issue.
Thank you so much, Ms. Molan. Although the committee doesn't, just some formalities before we commence. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. One of the things that is our usual practice is to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion by way of some questions and comments from members of the committee and yourself. But I'm just very conscious in a committee inquiry like this, that where we're dealing with a lot of things around, legislation, technology, regulation, that what we're fundamentally dealing with, and the importance of this inquiry is because of people and people's experiences and stories and perspectives, and also to make sure that some of those stories and experiences that we've heard from the past are not the stories and experiences that are, that occur in the future. And so I guess I'd just like to invite you, if you'd be comfortable, to perhaps provide a brief opening statement, but also to give us some context about, as you described, some of your personal experiences in order to sort of help set the scene and just give some broader understanding, not only to the committee, but also to those people who may be listening and for the benefit of the Hansard transcript.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with you absolutely that I hope that some of the stories that I have shared in the past and that I'll share here today and those from plenty of other people will mean that we hear less of them down the track. That's been the entire motivation behind me speaking out about this issue for a very long time. It's never been about myself. I'm pretty battle-hardened in this space, which is quite sad in itself, to be honest, that you almost need to get to a stage where it doesn't impact you to the same degree anymore. But I hope that down the track, my daughter and other children and other adults in this country won't ever have to be subjected to some of the things that I have been over the years, and not just people in the public eye, but tens of thousands of Australians some of whom have had their lives ruined by things written on social media. I think the catalyst for me, this has happened to me for a very long time. I've been targeted in many, many attacks. And I guess, first of all, I always like to make very clear that this is not about people going online and writing that they don't like me or writing that they disagree with something I said or even to an extent writing that they think, I'm an idiot. This is about when people cross the line. This is about when people make other people fear for their safety, or when people push other people into places that are not good and not healthy, and that create a danger for themselves and other people. And that happens online all the time. I think the real catalyst for me starting to speak out and going to see the communications minister, which I did a couple of years ago, was Anthony Seibold, the former Broncos coach. And what really resonated with me in his story, and he was targeted in some really vile attacks on social media, was the fact that he was not even on social media himself. And we often hear from people, they say, oh, if you don't like it or if you're hurt by things that are said, just get off. For starters, no, that's never been good enough for me, because social media is such a big part of what we do. Being online is such a huge part of how we live our lives now. So much of what we do is online. Why should I have to get off because someone's telling me they're going to rape my 2-year-old child? Why do I have to get off a platform that I use professionally because someone's threatening to rape my child, get them off the platform. And Anthony Seibold's situation, I mean, he's spoken openly about it. His life was almost ruined, and elements of it were ruined by things written online about him that were not true. He's not on social media. And this is the point that I make to every Australian. We are all so vulnerable to these attacks. We are all vulnerable to having our lives almost ruined by things that are said and done on social media. So it's something I'm incredibly passionate about, something that I think is worth fighting for. We no longer live in two separate worlds. We don't live in the real world and we don't live online. We live in both worlds and we move seamlessly between the two worlds all the time. COVID has meant that even more so we're reliant upon the online world to stay connected, to keep in touch with friends, to cure loneliness. There's so many wonderful elements about being online. It's no longer a choice. It should be a safe environment. Just like I know when I walk down the street, there are laws in place that should keep me safe. Do they always keep me safe? No. But at least there are laws in place that should keep me safe. In the online world, they just haven't existed. And one of the reasons I think this has been such a huge issue is that there haven't been any consequences to so many of the actions online. You speak to anyone in the world, if there is not a consequence or a punishment for a particular action, most people are good people and won't do it, but there's a certain sector of society that will do things if they think or they know they'll get away with them. And that's been the issue. They've been anonymous and they've gotten away with it forever, so there is no incentive to stop. There are laws in everyday society that control our behaviour and teach us how we can interact and what we can and can't do. That has needed to happen online for a very long time.
Ms. Mullen, thank you. And thank you also for your passion, and also thank you for appearing, because I know that although you've probably spoken about this before and potentially many times, as you've said, you're determined to make sure that something is done about it. It's not always an easy thing to speak about. And I just want to express my appreciation and the appreciation of the committee for you being here today and for being so willing to be so passionate about what is, I believe, an incredibly important issue. When the experience of online, abuse and bullying first happened to you, I guess be interested a little bit more about, if you don't mind sharing an aspect of that you're comfortable with sharing. And also, I guess, what changed for you in that moment, once you had experienced that? Could you just give us a bit of a personal perspective that way? Yeah,
sure. I think you never think that it will impact you in the way that it does. I think, and as I said, I make the point again that I'm not just talking about people in the public eye or personalities, reality stars, and they all should be afforded the same protection as anyone else. But this happens to everyday Australians. And when it started happening to me, I'd always considered myself a pretty strong, resilient person. I come from pretty good stock, if I might say so myself. Dad and mum are incredibly strong and resilient humans, and we were raised to really value what matters in life and to be good people and to be tough, essentially. And I think what really struck me was the impact that this abuse started to have on. And when I say abuse, as I said, I'm not talking about someone going online and saying that they think I'm a flog, or that they think, that my opinions aren't great, or that they think even to a degree that what I'm wearing is stupid. I can handle all of that, but it's when it started to get really, really intense. And, I noticed when I first started on the Footy Show, some of the commentary that would not just be written online, because I'd never go and seek it out. I learned that lesson very early on, but things that were sent directly to me on platforms that I used professionally were just horrific. Not things like, we don't like watching you, but things like, we will ensure you die, I'll hit you with a bus, things that were so horrific about what they would do to me if they ever saw me, that made me fear for my safety, essentially, and made me nervous about going outside. And the detail in which people would send me things that they would hope to do to either myself or my child, it starts to really, it starts to get really heavy. And as someone who's, been through a fair bit privately, as I said, I never thought I would fall into the category of someone that would be badly affected by something that someone anonymous would write either about me or to me online. But when I started to feel the way that I started to feel about it, it made me realise that, gosh, if I've managed to overcome everything I've overcome in my life, and I've had incredible support and an incredibly privileged upbringing with parents who would help me and save me from anything, what about the other people in this country and all over the world who don't have those support systems in place? How do they get up every morning when they're subjected to this? And as I started to kind of reflect more on how it impacted me, I started to reach out to other people, and privately at first, because I found it quite humiliating. Anonymous people would say online, or things they'd say about me or send directly to me, and you might feel ashamed by it. But once I understand that shame actually lies with them, and these people are anonymous for a reason, and they're vile human beings. Once I started to understand that, I started to look into just how widespread this was. You know, initially I thought, is this just something that happens to people on TV? Is this just, you work in the public? Started to realise was this happens to so many people, and particularly young people, and so many teachers I spoke to, so many parents spoke about the fact that the first 2 or 3 hours of school each day is not English, maths, geography. It's dealing with the fallout of what has been said. Or it's easier to say offline. You can't. Kids are learning online now. We have to accept that kids will be online. None of them should ever be subjected to any of the stuff that a lot of them are. And yeah, it's quite harrowing. I feel silly saying that because my sister's gone through bowel cancer. I know, and I've done so many stories on horrific things, and I kept thinking, God, do I need to just get a dose of perspective on this? But you can't control how it makes you feel, and you can't control the impact that having that I have has on a person, and that's just life.
Ms. Molan, thank you. I pause because as you speak, I'm reflecting on my own experiences, and I resonate very clearly with what you're saying. But I also resonate, your story is resonating with the experiences of so many people I speak to in my community, and even, dare I say, young people, young children of primary school age who share what is happening to them. And I did have a question. You basically answered it, you know, obviously in your processing and determination to do something about this. You pretty much answered the question. I was going to ask you whether you thought it was because you're a public figure, and you've pretty much answered that and just said, you know, this is something that it shouldn't matter. If I'm correct, you're saying it shouldn't matter your position, your status, your gender, anything else. Abuse is abuse, and you know, this is not okay. You mentioned, there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you. One was in relation to you mentioned a comment about support systems in place, and I just wonder, would you like to make any further observations about that? Because the experience of feeling bullied or abused makes you feel very, very alone. You were very powerful in a comment you made about shame lies with them, but I take it that behind that, and perhaps this gives you a little bit of my own personal processing and personal experiences, that behind that lies the challenge of first having to deal with your own sense of shame that it could happen, and that people have said these things. I'm just wondering if you would be able to elaborate a little bit further about one or two of those comments.
Yeah, and I think they're saying that if you don't ever want to look like you were trying to be a victim, or you're playing the, you're saying, well, so many of the content, what I see, and so much of the abuse that I receive is gender-driven, and this is to do with what I look like, and is to do with
Ms. Molan, I'm just going to ask you to pause. If you, I'm sorry to do this, it's a very powerful answer. I just want to check with the secretary. If I could just check with the secretary about the buffering.
woman. dominated fields, I didn't want to talk about it for a long time because I wanted to be defined.
Okay. Sorry, Ms. Molan, I'm not sure if you can hear me at the moment. There's been a problem. I've heard, actually what I've heard is very powerful, but there's been a problem with buffering and we've actually lost your voice at the moment. I will start that question again if that's okay, but just perhaps ask the Secretariat if there's something we can do to resolve that, even if we turn off the video camera or something.
Have you got me back? Is that you've got me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Did you want me to turn off my video? Would that be helpful?
I'll just check with the Secretariat as to their technology advice.
Chair, we're
just checking with broadcast.
Yeah, Chair, we're looking into that. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Molan, if you could just, if you don't mind, commence again. We can hear you now, and perhaps turn the video off if you feel that might help a little bit better, because what you were saying is very powerful.
Chair, could you just repeat the question to me, please, if you could?
Yeah, of course, thank you. I made a couple of initial comments, which I won't repeat, but I was really struck by a couple of comments that you made. One was around how you talked about your support systems that you had in place, and I think you may have also questioned whether others may have had the same level of support systems that you had. And my first question is if you could elaborate a little bit more on that and perhaps what needs to be done in that area. And the other was just a very powerful statement that you made about how the shame actually lies with them, with the perpetrators, but that in saying that, I presumed, partly based on my own experiences, I will say, and personal processing, that to be able to recognise that you probably first have to deal with some of those overwhelming feelings yourself about the impact that abuse actually has on you. And I was just asking you to perhaps expand on some of those observations and any further comments you might wish to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the shame element, as I said, is something that I dealt with for many years, and I would get really embarrassed whenever I was asked about the things that were written about me or to me online by journalists or different people. And I think when you're subjected to something so often and for so long, and it's so repetitive and so awful, even the strongest people in the world can start to maybe believe that a bit of it is true, or that what people are saying to you they think should happen to you, or the way they feel that, you know, potentially you should be treated, or things that should happen to you that are horrific. You start to think, first of all, you know, are they right? Second of all, you start to think, does everybody think this? Is this the thought of every single person? And if it's so extreme and so repetitive, as I said, I think even the strongest people would go down that path, and you've got to really stop yourself, and you've got to really you've got to get people around you that are amazing. You've got to, you know, it took me a long time to realize that it didn't actually matter who you were or what you did, that this kind of thing happens. And as you said, it's the perpetrators, and they are perpetrators. That's not a strong word. That is the right word for it. They are perpetrators. That they are the people that have the issue here. They are the people with the problem, not you. But, you know, the other thing I mentioned earlier regarding being a woman, and I've been a woman in a male-dominated field for many, many years. And I think, you know, when I saw other people potentially talk out about this, you would see so much commentary around it, that they were playing the victim or playing the gender card. And it made me almost very reluctant to ever speak about this experience, because so much of the content and the things that were sent to me had an angle that involved my gender. But the second you say that, you get accused of playing that gender card. And that's something I never wanted to be accused of. I never wanted to do. So the element of shame was certainly there. But as I said, once I realised that Mother Teresa could build an orphanage in Botswana and they would still go online and absolutely annihilate her, once I realised that it happened to tens of thousands of other people, it's awful, but you almost feel, I felt a little bit comforted by the fact that maybe actually I wasn't all the things that they're saying I am, and maybe I don't deserve to be raped or killed, or my daughter doesn't deserve to be attacked because for whatever reason this anonymous person online feels the need to send it to me. So once I realised that, it became a little bit easier to deal with. When I talk about support systems, I talk about my personal support systems, which have been, incredible for me over many years. And in terms of and that's, I mean, you know, my parents, my partners at the time, friends, family, colleagues have all been really amazing. In terms of other support systems that might have been in place or might have helped, they just haven't really existed, I don't think, up until very recently. And you kind of didn't really have an avenue. You could go to the police, but they were essentially powerless, really, or, you know, unless they could force social media companies to identify who was sending things, which hopefully this will now enable them to do. It was almost impossible to get help, and you feel silly. As I said, there's so many other people going through so many other things, but the personal impact of this on people, and we've seen people take their lives, we've seen kids try to take their lives, we've seen so many lives ruined by this kind of behaviour. It's not weak, and it's not for the vulnerable, it's not for the people who aren't resilient. Strong people get absolutely annihilated and torn to shreds by this kind of behaviour by anonymous trolls. And you take away their anonymity, and you take away their power, and all of a sudden it's a level playing field again, and that's what it needs to be.
Chair, do we have you there?
Deputy, the chair has just had some technical issues and will be rejoining in a moment.
It's Celia Hammond here. Could I, while we're waiting for the chair and deputy chair, could I perhaps step in with a question?
Go for it.
Back to Ms. Molan. Thank you very much for sharing all that you've shared today. I do know that it will resonate with many, many people across Australia. Did you approach social media companies to seek their assistance? And what was the response that you got from those social media companies?
Yeah, initially I did, absolutely. And Facebook was kind of the big one for me in the early days. And I think I lost a lot of faith out of that interaction and that experience, to be honest, moving forward. And the more I developed an interest in this area, and the more I read and the more I learnt, the more I realised just how little they really care about the welfare of basically their customers, which is the people that use their accounts. Facebook, I reported some horrific messages from an account, and the account kept being recreated. I would block it, it would be recreated. And I remember Facebook sending me a reply to one of the report mechanisms that I'd used for this message that was about, I was pregnant at the time, that was about trying to kill my child within my stomach. And they came back and said that it didn't meet the threshold for inappropriate behaviour. And I think that for me is when I went, well, for starters, is anyone actually looking at this? Is anyone reading this? And secondly, if that does not meet your threshold, then what the hell is your threshold? Because that is appalling. So look, there's been, even reporting things on Instagram, you feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, because you look at their business model. Advertising is the biggest thing for them. The more people they have in their account, the more advertising they get. They don't want to verify every single user on their account. They'd love one person to have 8,000 accounts because it gives them more people to sell to advertisers. So it just feels like you're banging your head against a brick wall. I can't see them ever doing anything off their own backs, or ever, cleaning it up themselves.
Yeah, so when you contacted them and they wrote back to you and said that doesn't meet our threshold, did they send that back to you in writing?
It was like an automated message, yes.
Wow. Okay. And I've never looked into it, but did you try and use their disputes or appeal? Do they have an advertised disputes or
Oh, I
appeals?
think I would have. This is a fair few years ago. I think you actually really just get to the stage where you think it's just too hard basket.
Yeah.
What's the point? What's the point in, you're already got a million other things you're trying to do. You've gone to the police, you're trying to do so many other things. You just get to the stage where you think, why would you go to a company who profits off this to try and help you?
Yeah. And the problem with the law, isn't it, that at the moment, some of those statements that people make to you, they would actually amount to potential criminal offences. Threats to do harm, threats to assault, threats under criminal code could be deemed to be criminal actions. But if they're through, the police are hamstrung if they're anonymous accounts. That's where one part of the issue lies, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's it. You're exactly right. I mean, there's different powers that the police have in regards to using a carrier service to intimidate, harass, and there's different pathways. But up until now, the police can contact social media, and I've had the police do this before. In some cases, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter will assist the police in some capacity, and the police have laws they can use. But I just don't think they're that effective, and the legislation just hasn't existed until now. And, the police can't do anything if they can't search an IP address. They can look at it through those kind of ways, but social media are essentially a protected species in that space and have been for a very long time.
Yeah. My final question, I'm assuming the chair or deputy chair, yep, they seem to both be back online. Sorry, the system just is peculiar today. I can receive you well and clearly in the West, in Western Australia, but that's probably because it's still early over here and people probably aren't online. Ms. Molan, just getting back to it, a number of other people have submitted to this inquiry in the context of it's not just about the individual issues. We've also got to look at it from societal, I guess the societal approach to online issues. What role do you see government having in that? I don't think that government can fix all of societal ills. Never has been able to. I doubt it ever will. But what role do you think that government should have in addressing the societal issue that is arising because of these impacts?
And look, nor should it. I don't think everything is a government responsibility, to be honest. I think it's a great question, but it's a really hard one to answer. I look at how people interact in person with each other and the kind of society that Australia is, I think, on the whole, and by and large is a wonderful place where we respect each other, where in the street people smile and say hello, where we have conversations. In a workplace, you would say hello to someone, you might have a chat, you would generally be polite, just the way we would interact. Even if you weren't particularly fond of someone, you would still treat them with a base level of respect. That's what our society is based on. But in the online world, that just doesn't exist. And how that impacts society, well, some of the behaviours and some of the things, and I'm now moving into a space where I'm not talking about things that you would legislate. I'm not talking about death threats, but just generally the way people interact is horrific sometimes online, and it's mean and it's nasty, and it's not the way that, it's not the kind of world I want my daughter to grow up in. I'm sure it's not the world that any Australian wants to grow up in, of course, apart from these people that perpetrate that kind of behaviour. I don't think the government can really play a role in that area. I think the legislation, to a degree, tells us what we can and can't do from a legal perspective, obviously, and it sets a bare minimum for behaviour, and it goes to that upper threshold of threats and harassment. But at least there we've got a starting point. Once you cut out the real upper echelon of real nasty, vile stuff on social media, hopefully there's this filtered effect where it just becomes nicer. And once you get one person who's either put in jail or fined a significant amount of money, or who's just, and God, could you imagine, forced to pay in some way for sending a threat to rape a 2-year-old child, there are some kind of consequences for that kind of behaviour, then maybe, just maybe, other people who might have gone online and written something, not to that extent, but pretty nasty or vile, might think twice about doing it. And I think you'll then see that kind of impact move into more of a societal aspect, and society then gets cleaned up a little bit because you cut out the real top stuff, and hopefully there's a filter down effect. But I don't think it's a government responsibility to legislate or to tell us all how to treat each other and behave. You know, they should do the real tough.
Like pass legislation that says be nice or not online.
Correct. And that's ridiculous. And we also, you know, we need to be, I was speaking with a group of kids at a school with the Prime Minister a month ago. Kids also need to be resilient. Not everyone is nice, and not everyone's going to like you, and not everyone's going to say nice things about you. And that's part and parcel of life. You know, we don't want a whole generation of kids who aren't resilient and who can't stand up for themselves and who can't hear something a bit mean and still say, well, that's fine, that's their opinion, I'm going to get on with my day because I believe in myself. We need that aspect as well. But what we don't need is when people online tell kids to go kill themselves or tell me they're going to kill me, or when it just crosses that line.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to the Deputy Chair, I just want to thank you for stepping in earlier. Very much appreciate that. And I know you do have some questions. Ms. Mullen, if I could ask just a few questions before I hand to my Deputy Chair again. I was very interested in the comments you've made around, you know, your earlier answer to Ms. Hammond, but then also in reference to an earlier answer you made to me around people suggesting to you that you should be the one to actually leave the platform. It occurred to me as you were speaking, I was thinking about a policy of the New South Wales government actually in relation to family violence. And at the time it was called Staying Home, Leaving Violence, where in other words it was flipped, where the perpetrator was asked to leave and the person who was being abused was able to stay in the family home and didn't have to flee. And it just occurred to me as you were talking to me about your experience with one of the platforms saying it didn't meet their threshold, which I do find strange myself. I just wonder, I'm going, well, what are your views on flipping it? In other words, rather than you or anybody else, any other user who is experiencing abuse, feeling that the only way they can feel safe is to leave, what is your view on perhaps requirements that actually say if you're going to behave like this, you're out, boot them out?
Absolutely. And that's kind of been my, I guess, the thing that I've focused on really from day dot in talking about this. And there was a piece that I did on a radio station a few years ago that got a fair bit of traction. And it was essentially that, you know, the amount of times people have said to me and unsolicited, you know, I don't, now I talk to people a lot about it, but prior to speaking publicly a couple of years ago, I didn't talk about it at all. But people would say to me, just get offline. And you're exactly right. It is actually, it'd be like, you know, someone in, as you said, a domestic violence situation. And often it is, of course, a victim that does have to leave the home. And that contributes to a whole other myriad of issues and you know, difficulties and why it is such a huge issue, because it is so complex. But it'd be like in any other crime, you would never say to a victim of a crime, and this is a crime. Let's not kid ourselves. You know, some of the behaviour and some of the things that occur online are absolutely crimes, and that's why this legislation will now make them into crimes, and it needs to. But you would never say to a victim, oh, just don't have your shop right here because there's heaps of robbers that are going to come, so just move your shop. You know, you don't. You stop the robbers. Like it's in any other area, we arrest and remove perpetrators and we punish perpetrators. We don't do that to victims. And I just feel like in the online space, and there's no malice, by the way, in people saying that. I think initially, even 3-4 years ago, even now to a degree, when there's nothing in place that protects a victim online and they are seriously damaged or seriously in danger because of what is occurring online within themselves, then maybe getting offline is the best thing for them because there's no alternative. But what we want to do is create an alternative. But we don't want kids or adults or businesses or anyone to have to get offline because they are being subjected to horrific abuse. You get the abusers offline. Stop them from joining Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and whatever else they want to be on. You know, there's no other place in the world where victims just get told, just don't walk into that shop, just don't walk, you know, I mean, we do get told don't walk onto the street. That's a whole other issue. But yeah, you're exactly right. It needs to be flipped, and you need to create tangible consequences for perpetrators. Right now, they don't exist.
Where do you think the responsibility for flipping it, as you say, should lie? With regulation and government requirements, or with the platforms, big tech?
Oh, look, it should lie with big tech. I mean, they make a heap of money out of these platforms, an enormous amount of money. They generate a huge amount of money. With that comes responsibility. They, of course, should have the responsibility to ensure that their platforms are a safe space, just like every workplace in the country needs to ensure that within their walls, it is a safe place for their employees. But they won't do it. This is the whole point. Unless there are laws that punish them for not doing it, why would they do it? That's why what the government is proposing to do here, and whether it needs some work or whether there's other elements of it to be refined, is to make big fines and consequences for social media companies so they do this. So the responsibility, of course, lies with the social media companies, but they ain't going to do it off their own backs. They don't care. You need to put rules, regulations, laws in place. Look, they'll fight it. They'll say, we don't care, we'll leave. No, they won't. They never will. Whatever you make them have to do, they will do, because it is a gold mine for them. So, and look, once we start doing it, every other country in the world will follow as well. They'll have no choice. So yes, it's their responsibility to create a safe platform. Will they do it? No. So the government needs to ensure that they will do it, just like it regulates a million other industries.
Thank you, Ms Molan. I've just had a request from the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Ms Molan. Thank you for your evidence today. On a very, very serious issue. The evidence you've given today about the impact on you personally from this kind of hateful abuse really accords with the evidence we've heard from witnesses to date. So thank you for that. I just want to assure you that all MPs from across the political spectrum agree on the need to deal with this issue and stop this kind of abuse. Given that, I'm just interested in your views on potential regulatory options for dealing with this problem. There have been a number of legislative approaches to responding to this problem in recent years, and the most significant of which, as I'm sure you know, was the Online Safety Act, which the Prime Minister has generously described as the Erin Molan Law, which is a great testament to your advocacy on this issue. So when that act was passed, you made a number of comments about the impact that it would have, that it would ensure that laws that exist in real life will now exist online, that it will help keep our children safer and every Australian adult, that it will hold perpetrators to account, remove their anonymity and create genuine real-life deterrence. It will force big social media companies to act. It will not infringe on freedom of speech in any way, shape or form. And you've similarly said in an op-ed on the bill that put one person who commits an offence under this new legislation, that's the Online Safety Act, on the front page of the paper with their fine in big bold letters, and 90% of this behaviour will stop. So is that still your view of the Online Safety Act?
Yeah, look, it's my view of what I hope it will be, and I'm no expert when it comes to government or when it comes to legislation or any of that kind of stuff. I'm passionate about this. That is absolutely what I hope this will do, and my understanding of what is being proposed, I think, will go very close to delivering that. I mean, the proof will be in the pudding, as they say, and once this is introduced and once it becomes law and once we see that first person on the paper, we'll then see the kind of impact that it has. But look, I think absolutely. I think a lot of what's included in there is going to be incredible, and I think led probably in a large part by the onus that's being placed on social media companies to clean up their own act, and the fines that are being proposed, and not just fines, because as I've said, they make a lot of money, they have a lot of money, but the other punishments that are being proposed for social media companies for not complying, for not revealing identities of people who send threatening and abusive messages and that kind of thing, I think will have a huge impact.
Great. So, I mean, the Online Safety Act, we passed it last year and Labor supported that. And it comes into effect on the 23rd of January of this year. So that's this Sunday. So for us as policymakers on this committee, forming recommendations about how we need to deal with this response, given your confidence in the effectiveness of the Online Safety Act in dealing with this problem, do you think it would make sense for government to consider the operation of this legislation? As you say, the proof will be in the pudding, before proposing additional regulation to deal with this issue? I mean, if the Online Safety Act will cause 90% of this behaviour to stop, wouldn't we want to see if that's the case before proposing additional regulation?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think anything in this space is better than what we've done in the past, which has been not a lot. So I think, look, yeah, look, as I said, you know, I can only talk about my experience and I can only talk about the impact that it's had on me. And having said that, I've now corresponded directly with thousands of people regarding the impact it's had on them. That's really all I can talk to. How this legislation itself will actually work, whether it's enough, whether we need to introduce more regulations now, that's not my field. You know, I couldn't say with any certainty whether or not we need more now, less now. This is such a new area. This is world first for the government. This is world first for this country. Essentially, I guess, look, the Online Safety Act, I was really happy with. From as I said, I'm not an expert in legislation. I'm not an expert in parliamentary procedure in any of this stuff, but my understanding of it, what I've read, is that this should be really effective. Do we need more now? I mean, I'm never going to say no to more that helps make the online world safer. But would I also be satisfied with seeing how this first step goes? Absolutely.
Yeah, so it'd be good to see the Erin Molan law in action, in operation, and to see whether it can be effective before moving on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So one of the issues that were raised with the Online Safety Act when it was being debated in the Parliament is that it's really targeted in at individual abuse. And one of the things we've heard from witnesses today is that it doesn't capture the online abuse that targets people's identity as part of a group. So as part of a religion or, you know, of a race or a sexuality. Do you think that the Online Safety Act should cover those kinds of group identities and abuse that's really targeting people for those group identities?
Oh, look, yeah, absolutely. I think any kind of abuse that is based on anything, essentially, you know, it would be great to be covered. I guess it's hard to cover everything. And as you say, those kind of things, when sent to an individual, are covered. But if they're just, I mean, this is where the social media companies need to come in. If someone's writing things that are abusive to a group of people based on religion, sexuality, gender, whatever, that's their area to clean up. And whether the government, you know, also needs to legislate in that area, it's a really good point. And I guess, you know, from my perspective, and whether you'd call it privileged or whatnot, you know, the abuse I've had has all been very direct and very, very towards me. In terms of other abuse that I might see online that I might feel targets me, but in a more general sense, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I think anyone's experience, if people feel incredibly hurt by things like that are online that are not directly directed to them, but are, you know, based on those areas, then yeah, I think look, as I said, it's hard to include everything, but that sounds like it's a pretty legitimate area that needs to be covered.
Right. And just as a final question, do you get the impression that, you know, in the period you've been advocating on this issue, that we've been making progress, that the terms of the debate have changed, that both government and, you know, potentially even the social media platforms are more engaged with this issue, more responsive to this issue? Do you think that we are moving forward on it at all?
Absolutely, without any doubt whatsoever. And it's only been probably in the last 6 months or so, but I mean, when I used to go out, I mean, I've got a 3-year-old, so I don't really go out anymore, but, you know, I'd go to a pub and people would ask me about the Raiders or you know, they might talk to me about the Roosters or something. I find now, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, when I go out, mums are coming up and talking to me about these. Young people are talking to me about social media. So many people now, I reckon it's probably 80% of what people talk to me about now is this campaigning work that I'm doing in the online space. Grandpas are coming up and saying, oh, I've got a daughter who's 14 and gets bullied horrifically online, and thank you for what you're doing. I feel like there's just a greater understanding now as to why this issue is important. I think maybe even a year, 2 years ago, there was this misconception that anyone talking about cleaning up social media or cleaning up the online world was, you know, some person with a public persona that didn't want people to dislike them or write mean things about them online, where it's just not that at all. It's not that in the slightest. And I think people now understand, and particularly off the back of Anthony Seibold and what happened to him, that this is not about influencers not, wanting to be liked by everyone. This is about the safety of every single Australian and the protections that need to be in place and the punishments that need to be introduced for perpetrators. I think there's been a real shift in the Australian society and in understanding why this is an important issue. And I think a lot of people have jumped on board, and even to an extent, social media companies, at least they're engaging in the conversation. I saw Twitter had put in a written statement, I think, to this inquiry. Not entirely sure about all of what they wrote, but look, at least they're engaging.
Yeah, I certainly echo your experience. I mean, I hear from my community that people no longer discount the kind of real life impacts of online behaviour anymore. People understand this is a real thing. Just one final question on the regulatory front. As someone that's experienced this kind of abuse as an individual directly at a scale, tragically, how did you consider using defamation proceedings against individual social media users to deal with this trolling? Would that have been a practical solution for you, given the scale and the number of people that were involved in this kind of behaviour?
No, I didn't. I've obviously publicly taken defamatory action against a very big media company. It's cost me a lot
that's
of
a
money.
different thing than social media, obviously.
Absolutely. But in terms of, no, I haven't. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that mechanism should exist for people. But I know firsthand how difficult it is to take legal action in that way. But I think it would also create a great deterrent for people online, because some of the most damaging things are written by anonymous people online. But anyone will tell you it is the process of trying to take action legally when it comes to something you consider to be defamatory. It is almost impossible, even for wealthy, set up, people with great content. It is so difficult to do. So no, I never considered doing it. I would have liked to, probably on occasion. There's been thousands of things written about me online that are just completely untrue and in my opinion, quite damaging. But no, I just didn't feel like it was a realistic or viable option for me, and still probably wouldn't know. And I think that's probably would be the experience of most people, because it is just so hard and so expensive to do.
Okay. Thank you for evidence, and thank you for advocacy on this really important issue that we all really want to tackle across the Parliament.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ms Molan, I really also join with the Deputy Chair in expressing our shared appreciation for your time and your attendance and your contribution today. My lasting thought, and from just from the previous statement you made, is that if it is too hard for someone with a public profile and more of an ability to be able to, then this really does demonstrate some of the size of the problem and the reason for this inquiry. And my hope would be that it is that through this inquiry we're able to look at some of these things that have made it difficult and have made the experience of online use too often an unsafe one instead of a safe one. And I think that's exactly, where the inquiry is hoping to go. So I just want to thank you personally as well, and on behalf of the committee, for your time and attendance today. And just indicate that if you have been asked or are asked to provide any additional information via questions on notice, if you could forward it through to the Secretariat by the 1st of February 2022, just to advise you that you will also be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you as well for tackling the challenges of some of the technological issues we had earlier. Do appreciate your forbearance with that, and and yes, again, we appreciate your time and attendance here today. I'm just going to suspend the committee for perhaps 30 seconds or so to enable us to get ready for our next witness. Where the public hearing resumed, and I welcome Dr. Michael Salter to give evidence today. I ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Thank you all, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Dr. Michael Salter. I'm the Scientia Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of New South Wales.
Thank you, Dr. Salter. Just some formalities to commence. To advise you that although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, that I should advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It's usual for me as the Chair to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we then proceed to discussions and questions from the committee. I'm conscious that in your work you would have heard first-hand accounts from many people who have experienced the sort of online harm and abuse that we, is part of the reason for this inquiry being held in the first place. And I'm also cognizant that as much as, part of the role of a parliamentary committee and government is to look at, legislation and regulation surrounding, technology use to ensure online safety, that the reason for this is at the heart of this, the why behind it is people and ensuring that people not only feel safe but are safe. And so I'm just wondering if as part of your opening statement you might like to provide any experiences, perspectives or sort of an understanding of how the experience of people to date, as well as any other additional comments you might like to make.
Thank you very much. It would be my pleasure. I'm joining you today from land of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation here on the Sydney coast. I'm a criminologist. I specialise in the study of child sexual abuse and also violence against women. And one of the reasons why my research spans across both children and adults is that particularly for victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation, including online sexual exploitation, the ramifications of that are lifelong. And it's very common when we're working with adults who have been victimised through sexual exploitation as children, that as adults they're struggling with their own safety. They may find themselves in violent relationships. They may continue to experience different kinds of exploitation. And certainly their mental health and psychosocial well-being continues to be impacted. I'm also the president-elect of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. So we are the premier global organisation for research and treatment in complex trauma, and I represent over 1,700 mental health workers who work directly with sexually exploited people. So in my role, I'm well aware of the devastation that online exploitation causes to victims, survivors, their families and their loved ones. I'm also aware of how difficult it is for both child victims and adult survivors who are trying to elicit a proportionate response to their victimisation from social media companies and internet service providers. Often child victims actually reach out to social media companies first. That's their preferred kind of mode of help because they don't want to tell their parents what's happened. They don't want to reach out to adult authorities. They often try and deal with it themselves. And when they're coming through to other services, so when they're then contacting online safety hotlines, for instance, it's often because they feel as though they've been failed by social media companies or that they simply haven't received any response at all. Social media has been designed and marketed to be particularly attractive to children and young people, but it was built without regard for user safety. The underlying business model aims to maximise profit by maximising the frictionless circulation of content and contact between users with a minimum of expenditure on content moderation and oversight. And this model has simply proved to be, over the last 25 years, incompatible with child protection. Social media companies tell us that they are just as concerned about child safety as we are, but the amount of child sexual abuse material reported to Australian and overseas authorities increases every year. Prosecutions for child sex exploitation offences in Australia are also increasing year on year. Abusers are using social media to circulate child sexual abuse material. They are using social media to contact, sexually harass, manipulate and extort children into producing nude or sexual content. And abusers are also using social media to connect with each other, to create online abuse communities, to justify their sexual interests, and to publicly argue for policy reform that compromises child protection efforts. Whenever these scandals are exposed in the press, we hear the same reassuring platitudes from social media executives And when pushed, they grudgingly adjust their operational models to placate public and political outrage, but their responses are consistently reactive and lacking in transparency and accountability. Facebook and other social media platforms are pushing ahead with their plans for end-to-end encryption, despite repeated warnings from global child protection authorities that such a move will undoubtedly result in the increased sexual abuse of children. Attempts to build child protection measures into software or hardware, such as Apple's recent tentative steps towards the proactive detection of child abuse material, are met with howls of outrage from the technology sector as well as privacy zealots. The lessons of the last 20 years suggest that self-regulation, co-regulation, and voluntary industry codes of practice are insufficient to keep children safe. The recent online safety bill is an important step forward in establishing basic safety expectations and addressing the lack of transparency and accountability in industry responses to child safety issues. The recently launched national strategy to prevent child sexual abuse also includes measures to work with technology companies around online risks to children. We do need social media companies to accept that they have a special duty of care to children on their platforms. We should also be cognizant of the broader impacts of social media and online platforms on sex offending as a whole. Online networks and infrastructure are awash with child sexual abuse material because technology companies are not legally obliged to proactively detect and remove that material. We have online communities of child abusers numbering in their millions who are taking advantage of anonymity and encryption. Establishing a baseline of online safety for children is an important step forward, but it can't be the final word. And there is a lot more work to do to ensure that social media and the internet is functioning in the best interests of children.
Dr. Salter, thank you very much. I've written down a couple of questions I have actually, and I might even ask in your capacity. You mentioned that you were an incoming president of an organisation around trauma and dissociation. Did I hear that correctly? Yeah, it would be an interesting one to have a discussion about if we have some time, particularly connecting back to this subject. But I know the Deputy Chair does have some questions. Questions from the Deputy Chair?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for joining us, Dr. Salter. I just want to ask a super big picture question to start off here. On social media, you've regularly called out that the cultural disconnect between technology companies and tech libertarians with those working in the child protection space, either researchers or in the advocacy or service delivery space. So thinking about that, what do you want those in the technology community to understand about your research and the work that child protection campaigners are doing in this space? What are they not getting at the moment that you would like them to be able to understand about your work?
I think what they don't understand is that we have a significant proportion of dedicated child sex offenders who expend huge amounts of time and effort familiarising themselves with online platforms. They jump onto new platforms as quickly as they are developed. They are quite intuitive in understanding the opportunities and the loopholes that online platforms offer them to abuse children, to contact other offenders. And so they will find all of the nooks and crannies that we leave in online architecture if we don't build child safety in from the get-go. And so far too often child safety measures are post hoc. They're built on after an online platform has been designed. And I think also for the technology sector, far too often, child sexual exploitation seems to them to be, I feel, a very abstract concept. These victims just seem to be just sort of ideas sort of floating around. There's this sense that there are children being abused. They just don't understand how many kids out there have been hurt like this, and they don't understand at a granular level what it is like for children and adult survivors to live with the knowledge of online abuse and exploitation and the long-term tail end of this. And so, I really see online abusers as sort of parasitic on social media and on platforms. And those safety obligations have to be a part of design from the get-go, not after the fact.
Yeah, so child sexual abuse on technology platforms is not a rhetorical device that people are using in an argument with libertarians. This is a very substantive, real-world atrocity that is going on and has been going on for a long time at scale.
That's absolutely right. And I think to a certain extent, the technology sector has unwittingly sort of been dependent on the profound kind of life-ending shame that victims and survivors experience. Victims and survivors where they've been abused online or they've been abused offline, but then their material is shared online, they don't speak out, they don't speak up, they don't identify themselves. They're profoundly humiliated, traumatized, to the point of suicidality. And so there's been this kind of silent but growing population over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think as a result, there are sort of cyber libertarians and privacy zealots for whom online abuse is a very abstract concept because they've never heard from a victim. And what they don't understand is that victims don't speak up. And in fact, it's not safe. I've done work on the dark web. I've seen communities of abusers organising themselves to try and identify the names and addresses of children in child sexual abuse material. And I know of cases, and I've worked with victims where they've done that. They've done that through social media. They've been able to track down victims and contact them through social media. It's absolutely terrifying. These are the realities of online sexual exploitation, and I think for far too long, they've been unacknowledged in the public domain.
So leading on to that, your academic research has identified multiple examples where users, rather than the platforms, have identified ways in which child sexual exploitation is taking place on various services. Could you walk the committee through some of those examples? I'm thinking, for example, the group that were congregating in YouTube comment sections around, well, in a different context, innocuous videos of children, how that was identified, how the platforms responded, and then how you think platforms should have been proactively addressing an issue like that.
Thanks, Deputy Chair. I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon where, social media companies and technology companies are telling us that it is not feasible, it's not possible to detect child abuse at scale. And yet what we have actually is social media users at the front line of social media platforms who are themselves the ones that are observing patterns of abuse, publicising it, in some cases taking action against it. So 2 years ago, there was a blog post that went viral. In fact, it was actually a YouTube clip that went viral by a blogger who had identified on YouTube. So children were uploading pretty innocuous videos of themselves dancing or doing gymnastics. And what was occurring in the comments of these YouTube clips was communities of pedophiles flooding into these clips and timestamping them. So putting a time that other abusers could flick forward in the clip to identify the most explicit aspect of the clip where the child might be inadvertently exposing a body part, for example. And this was endemic right across the entire YouTube platform. Now, the way that YouTube then responded to this, and again, it's really important that the response is post hoc, it's reactive, it's a response to a viral YouTube clip, is that they then demonetize all YouTube clips showing children. They turn off all of the comments on all clips showing children as a kind of mass and very blunt intervention into the problem. The other issue that was flagged around what was happening on YouTube was that YouTube, the algorithm, was detecting a group of users that was only looking at this potentially sexually explicit content of children. And the YouTube algorithm was then automatically curating a playlist of videos of children dancing and doing gymnastics and children in swimwear. So effectively, the algorithm has curated a pedophile playlist that is only visible to pedophiles. And far too often, this is what we're seeing occur on social media, is that the social media algorithm, this has been true on Twitter, it's been true on other platforms, the algorithm is creating a kind of a parallel social media universe for child abusers. But the social media response system is reactive. It requires users to detect and report inappropriate behavior. Well, if you're part of a community of child abusers on YouTube or Twitter or TikTok or wherever, you're not going to self-report the problematic content. So they're moving into these algorithmically created stratums of inappropriate child content that the rest of us actually can't see. They're in a sort of a parallel universe. So that's just one example of what we've seen on YouTube. Really one of the most distressing examples. I spent some time a couple of years ago working with a group of Twitter users who were child abuse survivors. Images had been made of their abuse, and they were on Twitter flagging child sexual abuse material on Twitter. And I have to say that the content that I saw when I was doing research with this group was the most serious content you can imagine on Twitter. It included videos of infant children being raped. It was absolutely horrific. And this was content that was widely circulating on Twitter, and it was up to child sexual abuse survivors themselves to hunt down this content and report it to Twitter, because there didn't seem to be any effective proactive measures by Twitter to take that content offline.
With the Deputy Chair's indulgence, and I thank you, Deputy Chair, that's a very powerful response that you've just made there, Dr. Salter. I just wonder, I guess the question up front is, what do you think should be done about this? And the reason I say that, you know, your comments and a very alarming description. I have an 11-year-old daughter who dances, so I hear you completely, exactly what you're saying. But I have a 12-year-old son who loves YouTube. And when I go to, you know, Year 6 classes, and my usual question to them is, what is it that you want to do when you grow up? It's one of the questions that starts the conversation about opportunity and choice and all of these aspirations, all of these really important things for young people. You know, it's always doctor, policeman, soccer star, surfer, I live near the coast, accountant, you know, teacher, all these other things. But, you know, more and more, I want to be a YouTuber and make money off, you know, YouTube. This is becoming a new normal that when we were growing up, certainly, you know, didn't exist for us. I look at what you said about algorithms being reactive, not proactive. I couldn't agree more with you. And, you know, some of the comments you've made, I'm still coming to terms with the reality of what that actually means. But then if I put that side by side with, say, at Instagram, and, you know, you can have a wonderful experience online. I don't think it's all about, you know, awful experiences. Sometimes you have wonderful experiences. I've been finding some fantastic content thanks to targeted Instagram algorithms directed at me, and I've actually been finding some tremendous stuff around some areas of mutual interest, Dr. Salter, that we might perhaps speak of at another time. So I know that algorithms are very important, and they can be used for good, if I can put it that way. But here's my question: they can be used for good to target, you know, appropriate, useful, helpful information to a user. They can be used to monetize, various shopping, other things. Why are they not being used for good for users to protect them and to enhance online safety? Why are we not flipping it? It just seems everything is the wrong way round. That's my question to you. What do you think should be done? And if you were making recommendations in this inquiry, what recommendation would you make specifically around these things around algorithms?
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a really important question. I want to draw a very quick analogy, and it's a strange one, but it's an important one. In the 70s and the 80s, you know, huge social change, and one of the things that exploded was the need for childcare, daycare, as women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Now, the daycare sector and the childcare sector exploded, but without any appropriate understanding of the risk to children. There was, there was no screening, there was no safety with children checks, there was a lack of oversight. And as a result, in the 70s and the 80s, we saw significant issues with the sexual abuse of children in daycare and childcare centres, because the fact of the matter was we create, unexpectedly, we created an environment where children are very accessible, and that happens to be an environment that child abusers are drawn to. Now, as we realised the issue, we instituted child protection measures. And as a result, by and large, childcare and daycare functions as a public good and as a social good that I think we need to expand on, actually. So there's nothing wrong, as it were, with technology. There's nothing wrong, as it were, with algorithms. The question is that, I think they've been built and established with certain prerogatives in mind. And one of those is not child protection. Now, it is the role of government to articulate that obligation to for-profit companies. They're going to do it detracts from their bottom line. To any service provider that is delivering services to children that can risk whether they're delivering face-to-face or they're delivering that service online. It is the role of government to set basic standards and safeguards to ensure that children stay safe. And to date, that hasn't occurred, not just in Australia, but internationally. It's wonderful to see the tide turning. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Technology, has many social benefits and tremendous benefits for children, for as long as we have those safeguards in place. If we don't, then child abusers will overwhelm these services, and that's exactly what they've done. Algorithms and algorithmic detection has a critical role to play in child protection, and that role could certainly be expanded. There are automated detection systems for child sexual abuse material, for example. Technology companies are not obliged to use them, although they are very effective. There are also algorithmic detection systems for inappropriate words, word combinations, emoji uses that can be used to detect child grooming through message functions, for instance. Again, technology companies at the moment are not obliged to use those sorts of detection systems. So there is a lot that could be done at the back end and at the design end to make these products child safe. And that's all that I would ask, is that any service delivered to an Australian child, whether it's online or offline, does not come with a predictable risk of that child being raped or sexually abused.
Thank you, Dr. Salter. Just sort of listening to that, it's a common refrain from the platforms that they have zero tolerance for child sexual abuse material on their platforms, and that may hold true when they're made aware of that content. But given the scale and the volume of child sexual abuse material on not just technology platforms, but supported by the underlying infrastructure of the internet, it's clear that there's not a zero tolerance approach when it comes to systems design and the way that the platforms are built to operate.
So that's correct. At the moment, the policy settings, not just in Australia, but internationally, it effectively disincentivises social media companies from becoming aware of illegal or harmful content, because once they are aware, we start to see the expansion of their legal exposure and their potential liability. And so as a result, it becomes in the interest of social media companies to make it difficult for them to know about illegal content. And so when we look at the move of, say, Facebook towards end-to-end encryption of the messenger function, and in fact, Twitter has also articulated an interest in encrypting its direct message service, then effectively what this does is it creates a black box in which the service cannot see any illegal content that's being exchanged. And as a result, they're not legally liable for that content. There is no incentive for them to proactively seek out and remove that material. That's not just true of social media, it's true of file hosting services, it's true of a range of electronic service providers. But that is why the sheer amount of child sexual abuse material is increasing every year, in the order of 50%, is simply because this material is proliferating across services that have no legal obligation to proactively detect and remove that content. Law enforcement is focused on child sexual abuse material, particularly where there is a current victim, where there is somebody who is being abused right now, or there. We have some of the best police on the planet when it comes to CSAM in Australia, but they are the thin edge here. They're the tip of the spear. They are not going to remove the amount of child sexual abuse material. That ultimately has to come down to a question of regulation.
Yeah, in fact, it goes beyond the platforms not having an incentive to look for this. That there's an active disincentive, isn't there? I mean, when you look at the instance of Facebook, part of the reason that they stand out so much in the volume of reports made to like the US NCSEM is because they have been actively scanning on their networks, and it looks like the volume is so much higher on their network than anywhere else. But it may well be that it's just that they're the only ones who have been undertaking this automated scanning of content on their networks in the past.
I mean, that's a very good point from a public relations point of view. Companies are actually disincentivized to be proactive and also to be transparent. And to Facebook's credit, they are in fact very proactive around detecting CSAM. They are very open about what they detect and what they report. Now, in comparison, we see almost no notifications from Apple year on year, but there is no question that significant amounts of CSAM are being created and shared via iPhones, and also through various file storage and cloud storage facilities. And in comparison, Apple looks very, very good. And I am quite worried about particular corners of civil society who in fact champion that when it comes to Apple, and champion that as the industry standard, that all online data should be a black box that is cannot be penetrated by law enforcement or by government. And that's been quite vocally advocated here in Australia and internationally by certain not-for-profits over a long period of time.
Yeah. So you're one of 59 child protection campaigners and experts who have recently signed on to an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg calling on Facebook to take 5 steps to improve the safety of its platform. So those 5 steps were to share all of its internal research on the impact its platforms have on children's wellbeing, set out what research has been conducted on how the company's services contribute to child sexual abuse, publish risk assessments of how its platforms affect children, provide details of an internal reputational review of its products, and review the child protection implications of encrypted messaging. Can you let us know first whether there has been movement from Facebook on any of those 5 to your knowledge, and secondly, articulate why those are important steps, the 5 important steps that Facebook should be taking at the moment?
So we've only that letter a couple of days ago. In fact, it's been quite interesting.
Oh, sorry, witness. I'm having difficulty hearing you there. Chair, can you hear the?
I had the same challenge. What we might do, Dr. Salter, if you can hear me, can you just let me know? You can hear me?
I can.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
I can hear you now again, Dr. Salter.
We can
Thank
hear you now. Just before you commence your answer, if you don't mind, would you be in a position to send the committee secretariat a copy of that open letter for our submission purposes? Thank you.
So we've only received a response from Facebook a couple of days ago, and I suppose we're just thinking about our reaction at the moment. So first and foremost, what we're asking for is just basic risk assessment practices and transparency. So what are the sorts of internal processes and projects that Facebook has put in place in order to assess the risk to children for some of the major structural changes that they're proposing to make to their services? That includes end-to-end encryption for Messenger, which we're really worried about. It also includes potential changes to and alterations to Instagram. What does Facebook know internally about the risk and the impact to children posed by their platforms? And what is the evidence base, the child protection evidence base behind some of their proposed initiatives? And we're asking for transparency. Far too often, what we're provided by social media companies in terms of their reports is simply what they choose to release to us. They define the problem, they define the terms in the way that is most suitable to them, and they release the statistics that are most friendly to them. So we're asking for simple and basic transparency and accountability. We're asking for their evidence base for the changes that they want to make to their service. And given what is at stake and what is at risk here, which again is the sexual exploitation of children, it seems to me that this is a very low bar for them to clear, and they have made no commitment whatsoever in order to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Salter. I've just got one more question, and then I'll concede the speaker to the chair and other committee members. So in your academic work, you've been critical of government responses to the threat of online child exploitation that focus on parental responsibility and education. Can you walk the committee through your views about the limitations of an approach that focuses on parents preventing this kind of abuse and education of parents and children as a way of combating this abuse as a standalone?
So, of course, parental education will always be part of the online safety equation. There's no question that parents, of course, have a role in the safety of their children. It's also quite sensible to provide education to children about services and so on. The issue has been that over the last 25 years, that's been our primary bulwark to keep children safe. And we know that it's not working. We know that it cannot work. And the example that I'd give you is if we had no child safety standards for child playgrounds, and if child playgrounds were filled with sharp edges and bits of metal and plastic that were unstable and so on, it doesn't matter how much education we give children and adults about how to play safe on playgrounds. If the playground's not safe, children will come to harm on those playgrounds. And that is the case in the online environment. These environments are fundamentally unsafe at the moment. And so the focus, unfortunately, on particularly parental education can act as a sort of a distraction from the structural issues that are going to ensure that children will be unsafe now and into the future. So yes, we need to provide parental education, but we also need to attend to the fact that these platforms are fundamentally unsafe. We also need to attend to the fact that some children do not have protective parents for a range of reasons. They may not have protective parents because their parent might be working 3 jobs. Their parent might be experiencing substance abuse issues, mental health issues. Their parent might be incapacitated for another reason. That child might be in out-of-home care. That child might be in residential care. And I want to emphasize, these are the kids that abusers look for. These are the kids that abusers target. You know, the number of adult survivors that I've done research with where they were abused a month after their father had a heart attack, for example. There was a window of opportunity for an abuser to insinuate themselves into their life, and their abuser took it because their parent was incapacitated. Now, we know that online abusers are looking for those kids and they are finding those kids. The state has a particular obligation to children in out-of-home care because the state is the parent, and particularly kids in resi care. And so if our focus and if our emphasis is on parental safety strategies, then we are effectively abandoning those children who have been removed from their families, you know, and those kids are disproportionately First Nations kids as well. The other point that I want to make is when we look at child sexual abuse material, when we look at producers of child sexual abuse material, a lot of that content is in fact being produced in the home. It's being produced in the home by sexually abusive fathers and family members. And so what do we do for those kids who are unsafe because of their parents? It's their parent that is exploiting them. When we look on the dark web, when we look online, we see a lot of men who are abusers and talking about the fact that they're abusing their child. So, you know, I think, you know, as a community, I think as a country, we have to get real about the range of risks that are posed to children. Absolutely, we want to empower parents, but they cannot, unfortunately, they can't be the front line of defense. You know, child protection is a collective responsibility, and that responsibility is shared or should be shared by online service providers and, of course, articulated and enforced by government.
Thank you, Dr. Salter.
Dr. Salter, with your indulgence and the committee's indulgence, I'd just like to extend the time we have with you by another 10 or so minutes, if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time here. Very powerful statements that you've made, and I just want to note that Ms. Hammond has some questions as well. So I just want to go back to something and perhaps explore this at a later time. And I also note that I'm really interested in some of the observations you made around algorithms, and I wouldn't mind finding a way perhaps to spend some more time on that, not in this session. You mentioned that you were president or incoming president of an organisation that really looks at issues around trauma and dissociation. You spoke in the beginning of your evidence around complex trauma, and you indicated that people who have been the subject of online abuse are often, I think the words you used were, what I wrote down was humiliated, traumatised to the point of suicidation, I think was the word you used, or suicide. And that it's very difficult to speak out and to speak up. And I think you also framed it in the context of 20 or 30 year period, which is an extraordinarily long time. For the benefit of the committee, I'm wondering if you might be able to explain firstly what you mean by complex trauma as opposed to trauma. And secondly, its link, if any, to online abuse. And I guess I'm sort of asking a leading question because my understanding is often the abuse is not a one-off incident. Often it's something that is repeated. So just some observations and I guess some observations, any other comments you might like to make around that.
Thank you, Chair. So trauma is a term that refers, in mental health, it refers to psychological injury. And so when we talk about, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, this might be how somebody presents in the aftermath of a one-off incident, such as a car accident, for instance, where they experience very high and unremitting levels of anxiety. They experience intrusive psychological symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, and typically these responses would subside over a period of time. Not everybody will be traumatized by the same event, but we would expect these symptoms to subside over a period of time, and potentially they might be supported in that by a therapist. Complex trauma refers to more acute traumatic presentations associated with repeated betrayal and violation. So complex trauma typically involves interpersonal violence and betrayal, and a sense of psychological and often bodily invasion and degradation. So complex trauma is typically seen in the aftermath of child abuse, child sexual abuse, also sexual assault, domestic violence, and typically is chronic, is prolonged, may take many years to abate. But when trauma begins early in life, and when it is committed repeatedly and over a period of time, complex trauma can be chronic and unremitting, particularly without specialist support. And unfortunately, in Australia, it's very difficult to find specialist complex trauma therapy. It can be quite expensive and so on. In terms of its link with online abuse, it's very typical that complex trauma is present for victims and survivors of online sexual exploitation for a range of reasons. There may have been offline abuse that then goes online, or there may have been online abuse. So the child may have been induced into creating nude or sexual content. The continuing circulation of that material is extremely anxiety-provoking and fear-provoking. It's quite common for victims of online exploitation that they may be contacted repeatedly by abusers who may in fact blackmail them or extort them with the content. It may be the same abuser or a different abuser. The fact of their online abuse may then become known to their peers, for example, at which point they may be subject to extensive bullying at school. There really can be the perception for this group that their life is destroyed. Incredibly distressing for a young person, obviously, but also this anxiety, this trauma, it interferes with, we might say, a normal developmental pathway, both their psychological but also physiological pathway. So it interrupts psychological development, it interrupts neurological development. And so this then increases their risk of psychiatric and also autoimmune and other issues in adulthood. So one of the issues with online abuse and exploitation is the perception that it's just spaceless, it's everywhere, it's unremitting. Victims are always worried, who is looking at my content? Who is enjoying images of the worst time of my life? Does anyone recognize me? And this is a really significant fear of people where their abuse images have been shared online, or images of them have been shared online. They don't know who's seen that content. They can become hypervigilant, paranoid. So it's, this is a total sort of psychological catastrophe for a young person. And so we see complex trauma, dissociative disorders, non-epileptic seizures, depression, anxiety, suicidality, and often a lot of secrecy. So if the child's been abused by someone who's not their parent, it's really, and these children do reach out to hotlines and tip lines, they reach out to the kids' helpline. It's actually really hard to get them to tell an adult in their life because they're so ashamed of what's happened. So this is a really complex situation. I think there is work to do here in Australia to think about how we develop a holistic response to children that have been victimised in this way, in order to target their unique needs and vulnerabilities.
Dr. Salter, thank you. I'm wondering if you can take this question on notice, if you'd be willing just to share with the committee any observations you may have in relation to perhaps what more may need to be done or considered around this area of consequential harm, the impact on people, the impact on victims. I'm just, particularly with reference to the last part of your answer, I'm going back to something Ms. Molan said about support systems in place. So any observations you may have or proposed recommendations about what could be done to help, I know that there's often a long tail in terms of healing, that it's not something that, you go to a doctor and when you fall off an unsafe swing in a playground, to use your analogy before, you go to the doctor, you sprain your ankle or you break your wrist, there's a certain period of time in which there's a reset, a healing process that takes place. But I know that what we're talking about in terms of psychological harm, and you talked about complex trauma, it's not something that there's a defined period, there's a much longer tail. My question would just be around what further observations or recommendations do you believe that we as a committee ought to be considering in regard to that? Of course, we hope that these harms do not continue in the future, but where this has happened, what further work needs to be done or areas that need to be addressed, if that would be okay. Thank you. Questions from Ms. Hammond.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of your evidence today, Dr. Salter. We've got a lot of history in other areas of the impact of abuse on children. This wasn't the line of questioning I was going to follow, but after your last response, we had a Royal Commission into institutional child sex abuse. Does that inform your research as well in terms of a holistic approach, looking at, how it wasn't handled well and what we need to do now?
Thank you for your question. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the Royal Commission was a tremendous initiative. I think it's something that, as a country, we should be incredibly proud of. And one of the things that it did was it just highlighted the gaps and the contradictions in the system that are firstly exploited by abusers, and then secondly the cracks that victims and survivors often fall through. I think, you know, it highlighted the difficulty that survivors experiencing accessing support, therapeutic support, other sorts of supports around their psychosocial concerns. I think the Royal Commission also did a very good job in terms of mapping out the sorts of child protection obligations the child-focused institutions should adopt. And very interesting work done by the National Office of Children's Safety in terms of those national child safety principles. I'm curious about how those insights could be adapted into the online world, the sorts of proactive statutory duty of care obligations that we might reasonably expect online services to adopt in the same way that we expect offline services to adopt them. I'm interested in how we might use, you know, government purchasing power to reward good internet service providers by contracting with them, and frankly punish bad service providers by withdrawing government contract and support. So I think there's some really fantastic insights from the Royal Commission that we could adapt to the online space so that we're not having a new Royal Commission in 20 years' time talking about online responses to child sexual abuse.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Dr. Salter. So if I'm hearing you right, I think what you've said about education and prevention is really useful. Yes, it's got a huge role to play, but it's not the be all and end all. And in fact, we've got to make sure that we do it in such a way that parents whose children do end up being abused online don't then feel guilty or that they're at fault if they haven't been able to, for whatever reason, either capability. I'm tech useless, so a lot of the advice that comes out, you know, my kids could outstrip me, you know, in 10 seconds as to whatever I might do. So we need that mechanism. But I think what you're also suggesting is that we need legal mechanisms, one, to make sure that our the companies, tech companies, are properly accountable, and that might involve both making tech companies be proactive in these areas, but also be accountable and responsive when issues are raised to them. And at the moment, I mean, at the moment there is a dearth of that. Is that essentially what you see?
That's correct. If we think about sort of children's toys on the toy store shelf, we have basic safety expectations of the toys that we import and that we sell. We don't spend our time educating parents on the pros and cons of every single toy on the shelf. And we also recognize that there's new toys being produced every day. So it's just not feasible. And this is the case with online safety. There are new platforms being created every day. I mean, I specialize in this area, and I suspect I'm 2 to 3 years behind your average 14-year-old when it comes to familiarity with the latest trendy platform. So I think, you know, having these basic safety expectations, you know, and the eSafety Commission has done a wonderful job around safety by design.
Yeah.
These are the sorts of basic expectations that I think just should be built into platforms from the get-go. That is not too much to expect from an online safety, an online service provider, an internet service provider, that they're meeting basic expectations around child safety. We have those expectations across the board, and in a sense, it's been the online space where they've been sort of carved out as a special niche where we haven't imposed those expectations until now.
Yeah, I think that special niche comes from the argument that it's, you know, it's a global village, and this is where, you know, we're all supposed to take responsibility for ourselves, etc., etc. And an element of that resonates with me, and I agree. We do have to take responsibility for ourselves. But children, we've always had in society special laws to protect those who are vulnerable, or those who, at various points within their life, have some lack of ability to make, you know, sensible and reasonable choices, and or to protect those who fall vulnerable. So, I do think that there is a lot in what you have put before us today, and the research that you have done in this. So I thank you very much for your coming in and speaking with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salter. I think time, unfortunately, is our enemy in this regard. I have a suspicion that we could spend a great deal more time talking with you, and I hope that may be possible on another occasion or in another way. But I would like to thank you very, very much for coming here today, for making your time available, for your attendance today, and just ask that for any additional information that you've been asked to provide, whether you would please forward that through to the Secretariat by the 1st of February 2022. Again, we thank you for your time and your expertise in these matters, and it is very, very much appreciated. I just advise the committee that we will now suspend for a short break of approximately 10 minutes and resume again shortly after 11:50. Thank you so much. Everyone, the public hearing into the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference is resumed. And I now welcome Ms. Noelle Martin to give evidence today, and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
My name is Noelle Martin, and I'm appearing in my capacity as a legal researcher at the Mindjuru Tech and Policy Lab.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martin. Just some formalities before we begin. To advise you that although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the Chair's usual practice to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we then proceed to discussion by way of comments, observations and questions from the committee. Ms. Martin, I know that you have told your story before, and I just want to say thank you for your advocacy in advance. I've said to other witnesses, and I'll just say again, because I think it probably is the heartbeat behind this committee, that we're looking at issues of, legislation, regulation, technology, but really this is all actually about people. This is about people's stories, their experiences. This is about keeping people safe online and making sure that we're doing all that we absolutely can to be able to do that. And so in terms of your brief opening statement, or opening statement, I should say, I'm just wondering if for the benefit of the committee, you wouldn't mind referring to or just providing us a bit of background about your personal experience, as well as any other observations that you may have.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to appear as a witness in this inquiry. I'm a lawyer, legal researcher, award-winning reformer and activist, and survivor of nearly a decade of online abuse, in which anonymous sexual predators distributed digitally fabricated pornographic images of me, and later pornographic videos, specifically what is referred to as a cheap fake and a deep fake, falsely depicting me engaged in sexual intercourse, among other demeaning violations against my person and human dignity. My current role is as a research associate in the Mindjuru Tech and Policy Lab at UWA, where, along with my co-author, Associate Professor Julia Powles at UWA Law School, I'm writing a book on the sweeping implications of Facebook's, now Meta's, multi-billion-dollar plans to build and dominate the metaverse, and the urgent need for regulation to prevent and contain imminent and widespread harm. Today, I want to make 3 points. First, on the bill that is currently the focus of the committee, I believe that the bill is not an online safety bill, and it's not an unmasking online troll bill. It is pure and simple an assisting well-resourced defamation claimants bill. If this committee is serious about addressing online safety, about unmasking trolls, about improving responsibility by social media firms, or even about defamation reform, this bill contains fundamental flaws. I'm happy to elaborate further on these flaws, but the major one that makes this bill not worthy of its name is that it is utterly inaccessible to those who suffer the most profound harms facilitated by the internet: women, people of colour, and other marginalised communities. Without major renovations to the bill, it is a narrowly targeted reform that will only strengthen the hand of already powerful individuals. It is no bill for the safety of everyday Australians. I can confidently tell you, as a reformer who has spent years advocating publicly in Australia and globally against anonymous online sexual predators at an immeasurable personal and professional cost that will continue for the rest of my life, it feels like a slap into the face to those who have suffered devastating sexist and racist abuse to be completely overlooked and unassisted by this bill. Second, if this committee is serious about ensuring Australians are safe online, I and other survivors of online harms have the endurance and lived expertise to help you with an agenda for robust reform. I'm at your service in this task, and I'm happy to elaborate further on this agenda. Contrary to what this committee has heard so far, Australia's online safety laws and reforms, and in particular the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner, are woefully inadequate. The legal tools available to victims are superficial. The regulator continues to underutilise its existing statutory powers, misguides the public on its perceived successes, and the whole regime is quite simply ineffective in preventing or reacting to online abuse and providing meaningful support to victims and survivors. I applaud the conviction of the Morrison government in saying that it wants to protect Australians against online harms, but I cannot abide the hypocrisy of using the urgent, lethal, and devastating epidemic of online abuse to smuggle through a bill to wind back the Voller decision. Third and finally, if this committee is serious about holding tech companies accountable for the despicable online harms that have flourished and expanded on social media for nearly 2 decades, we can no longer afford to legislate with ill-considered regimes and schemes that are deflected by companies able to assemble 40 to 100-page briefs over Christmas for this inquiry. We cannot rest at fiscal civil penalties that are chump change to the world's most powerful companies. No, facilitating and enabling criminal conduct warrants criminal penalties. It is time the government upped the game, increased the stakes, and took genuine online predators and those who enable them to task. I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martin. I really appreciate your opening statement, and also I'd just like to express my appreciation for your willingness to appear before the committee and your determination to make sure that others do not experience the harm that unfortunately you experienced and outlined to us. And I can only just say we all wish that this sort of thing had never happened before, and it happened to you. I certainly hope that the work of the committee can contribute to addressing some of the issues that you have experienced, and I thank you again for appearing. If I could just clarify, the legislation that you're referring to is the proposed social media anti-trolling bill. Is that correct?
Yes,
yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I know that Ms. Hammond has a number of questions for you, but if I could just ask you firstly, in relation to another bill, now an act, a law that is coming into operation next week, the Online Safety Act. Just wondering whether you're aware of the changes under that act?
Yes, I am aware, and I'm intimately aware of the entire regime and scheme and systems that we have in place to tackle online safety in Australia. And I speak about the inadequacy of them from someone who's engaged or tried to engage with the system. And as someone who has witnessed how just completely inadequate it is to meaningfully provide any support and justice to victims. And I'm happy to explain exactly why I think that is. But if we take the image-based sexual abuse laws, for instance, it is limited in actually providing justice, particularly where victims who are being targeted by anonymous sexual predators anywhere around the world, it is limited in them being able to receive any form of justice. It is limited in them being able to identify who is responsible behind it. It is limited in terms of them being able to not be disrupted in their education or to be discriminated against by employers who want to be able to use what's out there of them to stop them from proceeding and being promoted in the workplace or from even accessing employment. It is limited in being able to successfully remove that content from the internet because, as we know, it proliferates online and it is extremely difficult to actually take down. It is difficult to deal with the sextortion of victims and survivors like myself, who was essentially extorted with a perpetrator saying to me that they would only remove the material of me if I provided them nude images of myself within 24 hours. So in practice, victims and survivors are being left without adequate support. And not just that, the existing powers that the eSafety Commissioner has are being grossly underutilised. So it has a number of powers already that it was empowered to I guess, use in the event of these abuses. But since the system of image-based sexual abuse was introduced at a national level in 2018, it has an extremely low rate of enforcement action. And I can tell you just from the statistics from their annual reports that although they have these powers to act on it, between 2018 and 2019, the eSafety Commissioner received 849 reports of image-based abuse, but only gave 1 removal notice, 3 formal warnings, and 8 informal warnings. That is a mere 1.4% rate of enforcement action. Between 2019 and 2020, it received 2,702 reports of image-based abuse, but only gave 7 removal notices, 4 formal warnings, and 1 informal warning, a mere 0.4% rate of enforcement action. Between 2020 and 2021, it received 2,687 reports of image-based abuse, but only gave 1 removal notice, 2 remedial action directions, and 2 warnings, a mere 0.1% rate of enforcement action. And I apologise if my calculations are incorrect, but the point still stands. And what that's showing is the eSafety Commissioner and the online safety scheme that we have in Australia, despite the fact that we might have some laws that deal with it, are just not being used. Victims aren't getting the support they need. And that is why I have deep concerns about new reforms to online safety in the country, because I worry that the same pattern will be true based on the regulators' own statistics that they've provided in their annual reports, and that was tabled in Parliament, to my understanding.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. I've got some questions in relation to perhaps some of the ways that the Online Safety Act, which is not yet in operation, but will be from next week, may help to address some of those issues. But I'm mindful of time, and I know Ms. Hammond has some questions. Ms. Hammond?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Martin, for appearing today. For the benefit of people who might be unaware of what it is that you're actually talking about, deep fake and cheap fake, can you actually just in very layman's terms explain what that is and what was the criminal offence that was perpetrated on you?
Right. So I was targeted by anonymous sexual predators who to this day have not been unmasked. To this day, I've not had an opportunity to ever unmask them. but I was targeted by anonymous sexual predators who targeted me since I was a teenager, in which they lifted images from social media of me, doctored them into highly graphic pornographic images, multiple pornographic images, distributed those online, many of which are still available, by the way, because of course the eSafety Commissioner cannot possibly and cannot actually remove that material from the internet, even though it has a scheme to do that. But then on top of these doctored images that were created of me, these online anonymous sexual predators took, advanced the stakes and created deep fakes and cheap fakes of me. Well, specifically one deep fake and one cheap fake. The deep fake is essentially an artificial intelligence. It's essentially using AI to generate fake videos and audio of people that is extremely hyper-realistic and almost indistinguishable from real life. And a cheap fake is essentially a less advanced version of that. But what these videos of me depicted were me having sexual intercourse and me performing oral sex in a way that did not happen and was not true. And they distributed that online. And of course, no accountability, no justice, no help for me to access employment, no support for counselling, no government, provide some meaningful support to me. An eSafety Commissioner who provides very superficial justice and support and who doesn't actually act on anything. I shouldn't say not anything, but certainly not a lot of things. And so that's just a bit of a brief summary of the abuse that happened to me. That I've still not had any prospect of justice, but I'm not really concerned too much anymore about me. I'm concerned by the fact that Australia is boasting how well it's doing in the online safety space, right? And I applaud it. I do, because in many ways we are, but in many ways, if someone like myself were to be targeted by the very same thing as I was today, despite the fact that now we have these laws, they'd still be in the same position as me. And I think that in many ways is an indictment on the legal system and the online safety framework that we have in Australia.
Yeah. Ms. Martin, how old were you when you became aware of?
I was 18 years old.
So it's had, and
I'm nearly 28 now. Well,
and there are still images out there.
Oh, of course, there are still images. There are still the videos out there. They have in the title of the deepfake video was my full name. So it's not just an abuse against my person. It's and also defamatory, I guess, because it's taken my name and attached it to these false images and videos.
So now you mentioned, and I think it was your second point, no, I think it was your third point, about holding tech companies to account with criminal penalties, not just civil penalties. What has been your experience of interactions, and I assume you have, because when you've approached the tech companies or the online platforms to say, hey, these are fake, these are disgusting, these are defamatory, get them down. What has been your response, the response that you've got from those tech companies, and how do you envisage the criminal penalty system working? I'd love to hear your ideas a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I come at that issue not necessarily from my experience and my lived experiences, but from my experiences as a legal researcher, directly and in very intensely looking at Facebook. And so if I were to use Facebook, for example, we have witnessed, the world has witnessed for nearly 2 decades, major significant issues with the company. 3 recent historical incidents: the Cambridge Analytica data scandal, the Christchurch massacre that was streamed live on Facebook, and the recent Facebook papers and Facebook files that we know from the Facebook whistleblower. And we've seen governments around the world and regulators around the world attempt to hold tech companies accountable for issues that happen on their platforms, right? So we look at, for example, in the Cambridge Analytica data scandal, one of the largest fines, if not the largest fine ever given to a tech company, was the US Federal Trade Commission's $5 billion fine for that issue, right? But that is chump change to $1 trillion company. We look at, in the UK, in relation to that issue, I believe it was 500,000 euros. Australia, on the other hand, was much slower to act. And my understanding is that the proceedings to actually deal with that issue are still ongoing, right? So we look at the Christchurch massacre. Again, Facebook essentially enabled in some way the Facebook Live streaming of the Christchurch massacre. And to this day, it's essentially evaded meaningful accountability for the role it played in the fact that the broadcast in that instance was viewed approximately 4,000 times before its eventual removal from Facebook. And so we know that, and even with the Facebook papers, the revelations that were revealed about Facebook, and I think that brings into question, well, then what will happen? From our track record, we know that the social media companies, including Facebook, are essentially going unscathed from any meaningful accountability, and the penalties that we have are not actually making a dent for these companies that are essentially being able to expand and grow despite the fact that they have the most horrific abuse and exploitation on their platforms.
Yeah.
And so I think it's time that we consider that a way to actually hold the tech companies responsible is to increase the stakes, because clearly pitiful fines and legislation that really leaves companies unscathed aren't sufficient.
Yeah. So, and this resonates with our previous witness, who also was talking about, you know, the need to actually make tech companies accountable both proactively and reactively and much quicker. I guess one analogy might be in the context of what we've done with workplace health and safety laws. To give them even greater strength, in one sense, we pierce the corporate veil at various times and hold directors or key management personnel potentially directly liable. Is that, and I'm aware that you're researching to write a book on this at the moment, would that be in line, you know, so potentially for criminal and for civil consequences, not just for the company, but for individuals as well? Would that be something that you think is worth looking at?
Yeah, I do think that we need individual accountability for the people at the top of these companies, because if there isn't that avenue, then there's really no impetus that I guess will actually require them to make sure that their platforms are safe. And I'm not really able to respond to the granular details of the example that you've given, or you know, the exact details of how it might work. But I think the principle is that what's happening right now isn't working, and the penalties that governments and regulators use to hold them accountable are not working. And so I think we really need to consider what is going to be the thing that actually pushes them to ensure that the platforms are not facilitating hate speech, abuse, you know, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, defamatory comments. And I think that's what's going to have to happen.
Yeah. So making them also liable in the event that you can't find the perpetrator. If they don't remove it, I think it's appalling that there's still images out there of you, despite a decade of you being very strong on this and very brave in coming forward, because I think what a lot of people might do, you know, it'd be very tempting in this sort of situation to retreat and go and hide in a shell, as we saw with Ms. Molan this morning as well, which was her comment. It's very, you know, the temptation is to run and hide from it because you think that everybody's seen it and everybody's judging and everybody believes it. So, yeah, I think that that's appalling. And perhaps if they were likely to face defamation proceedings because they haven't removed it, or they don't remove it as soon as it re-puts up, that, you know, given that you can't at this point unmask who did it. Chair, look, thank you very much, Ms. Martin, for appearing before us. I'll pass back because I know that others have questions that they want to follow up with you. Thank you very much for appearing.
Thank you. So I just want to clarify just on that, that a lot of the images and videos of me weren't necessarily, and in fact, majority of them weren't on social media services. They're on pornographic websites and threads and other. So, and so I just wanted to clarify that about the unmasking of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Martin, and thank you, Ms. Hammond. Questions from Mr. Simmons?
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Martin, for telling your story. I just wanted to pick up on the line of questioning from Ms. Hammond about criminal penalties that you were talking about. Are you aware of the, you mentioned the Christchurch massacre example, are you aware of the AVM Act that the government brought in after that example and the criminal penalties it has for executives who don't try and remove this kind of abhorrent violent material off their platforms, and do you think there's some merit in seeing it extended to incorporate other material like yours, where if it's not taken down within a quick time frame, that there is criminal penalties?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I did have a look at the Criminal Code Amendment, Sharing of Abhorrent Violent Material Act of 2019. I do think that that's something that should be extended, at least the principle of it, to actually make sure that the range and the suite of issues in relation to online harms are dealt with in a way that I guess is enough impetus for them to actually respond to it. And so I think, as we've seen from the various and vast amount of online abuse that's been allowed to flourish on their platform, whatever it is, or whether it be abhorrent violent material or online abuse or intimate images or videos or hate speech, that we have to be able to target that in a holistic sense, and maybe even specifically to make sure that they address all of those issues, and they have to do so because there is a real sense of accountability if they don't and if they fail to do that. So I think I would be completely in favour of that sentiment being extended. Okay, well, look, I think that act is a good example of what you're talking about. Certainly, when criminal penalties are involved, it provides a much better impetus for executives of these companies to act. Can I go to, because you are writing this book and in your role as a researcher, can I go to the data? The Facebook whistleblower just demonstrated for us how much data Facebook holds and doesn't release about how much content they find on their platform. But what how successful have you been in getting data out of them and other companies for your purposes in terms of trying to quantify the problem? And if government was in favour of regulating these companies to provide more details, what kind of details do you think would be beneficial for public knowledge and research? Right. So thank you for that question. I'm really happy to talk about that because I think it's something that is really underexplored by governments and by countries and by the broader public, in fact. So essentially, as you might have heard, Facebook is now Meta, and essentially what it's doing is they're trying to shift the human experience away from mobile phones and laptops in order to create the metaverse, which is essentially a 3D vision of computing that is hyper-realistic, where humans have these so-called avatars and that interact in augmented reality and virtual reality with VR headsets and augmented reality glasses, and live in this world that, I guess, converges the virtual and the physical. And already we are seeing that vision of the metaverse, which is a multi-billion-dollar plan, to life with their Ray-Ban stories, their smart glasses, with the Horizon workrooms, and a number of other technologies that they are already releasing to bring this vision to our society and to our reality. And they envision that this is what we're going to have to be dealing with, because it's going to be fully realized in the next 10 years, and in 5 to 10 years, this is what we're going to be seeing gradually integrating into our lives. And so what the purpose of my dissertation, my master's dissertation, and the subject of the book that I'm co-authoring with Associate Professor Julia Powles is looking at the mass amount of implications of that, and the fact that in due course we're going to have to reckon with the fact that on top of the existing swathes of information that Facebook collects and uses about individuals, which we know is an immense amount, what they're going to be doing is, and they're going to be having and collecting an unprecedented amount on top of that, because they're going to be collecting personal and sensitive information about us, because of the use of virtual reality and the use of augmented reality, in which you are in virtual form interacting with the world around you. And so I haven't directly gone to Facebook, for example, to receive information about the specific data, but I've referred to and I've researched what that might mean for us in terms of what they are going to be collecting, and what data they're going to be using in this world, on top of the virtual crimes, on top of the misappropriation, on top of the surveillance issues, on top of the privacy issues, so there are a broad range of implications. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
It does, thank you. And then just finally, because I know time's getting away from us, this deep fake technology is something that I think can be incredibly insidious, particularly around child exploitation. But I sit on another committee, and when I've raised this with law enforcement, I'll be honest with you that that they say that it is not a trend that they see a lot of. But given your experience and your research in it, I was wondering if your anecdotal data bears out the opposite of that, and then whether your experience is that perhaps law enforcement aren't hearing of it because people aren't willing to come forward because they don't see effective mechanisms, or just why it isn't translating from the data, if it is prevalent, to law enforcement.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because I'm not too sure about the prevalence of it in the child sexual abuse space, but I do know that there was a report that was released in 2019 in which it talked about the fact that I believe 96% of deepfakes are pornographic, and 100% are of women. There is, I don't recall the exact number of the amount of deepfakes that they looked at to determine that statistic, but I know that it is a growing issue. At least, from my experience, I believe it disproportionately affects adult women, and one of the issues with the prevalence of it and determining how it occurs on platforms and on the internet is that oftentimes victims who might possibly be the target of a deepfake or adopted image or something out there might not be aware of it at all. It took me a while to actually discover what was happening to me. For I think about a year, I'm not sure exactly because I wasn't the perpetrator, but my belief is that for about a year before I found out about what was happening to me, they were targeting me. And I know this because the threads and the websites that I discovered that actually hosted the images of me had been in existence for the longest time, had been amplifying and spreading. And if it wasn't for the fact that I originally reverse searched my image completely out of curiosity, I don't think I would have known or found out until years later when I was informed about it. So that's one of the challenges that we face, is the identification of what's out there, and that translating to the person who's actually the subject of it and the target of it. And then not just that, it's whether or not they even report it. Because, you know, we have major issues with our cultural attitudes towards this issue. There's a lot of victim blaming and slut shaming, and people are understandably reluctant to come forward, talk about the issue at all, or even, you know, go to law enforcement. So there are different factors that play as to why that might not be the case. But, you know, certainly it's probably not as a big of an issue as other forms of abuses and other crimes that happen online. But it is certainly a growing issue, and it is certainly something that warrants action because of the nature of the fact that it is almost indistinguishable from real life. And anyone can literally take anything of you and depict you doing or saying something that you did not do or say, whether it even be holding in a belief that you did not hold, or doing some crazy criminal act that you did not do, or in my case, falsely depicting me having sexual intercourse without my consent. So that, I think, is the danger of deepfakes.
Thank you very much. And look, no pressure, but if you have a copy of that study or can track it down, if you would mind sending it to the committee, that would be very helpful. Thank you. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons. I'm mindful of the time, but perhaps I would indicate that we might have some further questions on notice to ask of you, if that would be okay. And in doing so, just indicate that any further additional information that you might be asked for, or you have indicated you'll provide, if you could forward it through to the Secretariat by the 1st of February 2022. Ms. Martin, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all of the committee for your willingness to be here today, for sharing your story, for outlining the many challenges that you've encountered, and also, importantly, for highlighting some of the areas of reform that you would like to see reviewed. We really, really appreciate that. We appreciate your time, and thank you very much for appearing here today. Just to advise that you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I would like to thank the Secretariat, all witnesses present, and members of this committee for your time and attendance here today. I declare this public hearing closed and the committee adjourned until Thursday, the 20th of January, 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you.